Semitic Magic, Its Origins and Development by R. Campbell Thompson. Heroic demigods, or as they're called, have, for obvious reasons, never been sacrificed in babyhood, and yet they are clearly the result of the union between entities and women. Let's say demiurges, right? Because they're not creators themselves, they're acting in that role, right? Because they're working with what's there. It's not the same as, that's what's meant by a demiurge. It's not a real creator, it's something that works with what's there. Perhaps tells you that it's the real God. That's how I like to use that term. But anyways, again, it is difficult to see how the law of the first fruits of vegetables, etc., could be wrested into analogy. Furthermore, although this argument has a little force by reason of its proposed explanation, demons as well as entities married the girls of the tribe. But in this case, it is quite likely that the offspring are the abortions, and especially those with physical disabilities who are excluded categorically from the priesthood. The third sacrificial theory has already been discussed and seems the most probable. Agreeing with Fraser, we can hardly resist the conclusion that, before the practice of the redeeming them was introduced, the Hebrews, like the other branches of the Semitic race, regularly sacrificed their firstborn child by the fire or by the knife. And really, if you're going to look into it historically, the so-called Canaanites and the so-called Palestinians, you really can't tell the difference. Judaism wasn't mentioned by name until the second book of Maccabees, as far as anybody knows. Well, I mean, maybe there's been a more recent discovery. Judaism as something that could be identified as Judaism doesn't occur until about 540 BCE. And it's definitely not the faith of any of the so-called prophets that came to the Israelites. It's not the faith of any of the prophets who came to the Israelites. There's been modern Jewish claims to prophethood. There's been medieval ones too. But in view of our having no evidence that the Assyrians sacrificed the firstborn, I should suggest the substitution of other for the other. And there's the existence of a Nazarite class. The existence of a Nazarite class must not be forgotten. To this day, in Syria, women vow to give a son to God who is regarded as a sort of Nazarite, and his hair is not cut until he comes of age. And you can tell the difference between a person whose hair has been cut and a person whose hairs haven't been cut. There's like little barbs at the end of their hairs. The Levites are chosen from among the children of Israel, instead of all the firstborn that openeth the matrix among the children of Israel. Numbers 3:12. Sacrifice, okay. Reem's theory is... Okay, what is this theory? What's that mean? Stepsvandlich solit die menslik Esterbrucht nicht jäpfert werden vermogi ehres besonderen engorhig Keitsverhalt beses an Jehovah galten die Erstgeborenen vielmehr ursprünglich als die zum Dienst am Heiligtum verpflichteten Leibagenen Knechte Jehovah. Agreeing with Fraser, we can hardly resist the conclusion that before the practice of redeeming was introduced, the Hebrews, like the other branches of the Semitic race, regularly sacrificed their firstborn children by the fire or the knife. He maintains against Wellhausen and Robertson Smith that this redemption is a modification of the sacrifice of the firstborn, and he quotes in support of this the customs of many so-called savage tribes. In some parts of New South Wales, the firstborn child of every woman is eaten as a religious ceremony. In Sinjero, East Africa, many families offer up their firstborn as sacrifices. In the 1800s, actually, was the last human sacrifices in, the area that became called the British Empire. Executions were had for all, by the way. But I don't know if it was that common. And I think the Jews largely exaggerated about the human sacrifices of their neighbors being so common. Sejero, East Africa, many families offered up the firstborn sacrifices. Among some tribes of Southeast Africa, when a woman's husband has been killed in battle and she marries again, the first child after her second marriage must be put to death. If it were not killed, an accident would befall, and the second spouse and the woman herself would become barren. The third hypothesis, that the dedication of the firstborn to the entity had its origin in sacrifice, we can proceed to examine the evidence for cannibalism at such a sacrificial meal. Robertson Smith certainly has more hints at such a proceeding. The probability of such a hypothesis will rest on the evidence, pro and con, of the prevalence of cannibalism among prehistoric peoples and modern savages in general, and secondly, in traditions of the Semitic nations in particular, and in local forces which might lead to such a custom. Parts of the Americas and Europe is where cannibalism was the most common, according to the evidence that we look into modernly, genetically and the archaeological remains and stuff. Robertson Smith says, to conclude from this, that at one time the Hebrews actually sacrificed all their firstborn sons is absurd. He also quotes the so-called heathen Russians as sacrificing their firstborn with other instances. Now remember, before Christianity, the Romans and the Greeks, they didn't think anybody was pagan because of any particular religion they had. It was a material culture thing. All these poor people living in thatched homes and stuff out of the thing, rather than our homes of masonry and stuff. Wherever we find the doctrine of substitution of animal life for that of man, we also find examples of human sacrifice, sometimes confined to seasons of extreme peril, and sometimes practiced periodically at solemn annual rites. That's why the Orthodox eat lamb in remembrance of the Paschal feast. And obviously representing Jesus as a lamb. Back in the day, they would have pretended that Jesus, it's not just the blood and it's not just the wine and the bread. It's the lamb that they're eating, and other foods could represent. And let's be real, Catholics did that sort of thing too. I apprehend that this is the point from which the special development of theocular sacrifices and the distinction between them and ordinary sacrifices takes its start. It was impossible that the sacrificial customs should continue unmodified, where the victim was held to represent a man and a tribesman, for even savages commonly refused to eat their own kinsfolk, and to growing civilization, the idea that the entities had ordained meals of human flesh, our flesh that was as sacred as that of man, was too repulsive to be long retained. Well, when you eat a sacred meal, it kind of does become sacred, at least in your eyes. And that's not so repulsive that, oh, I'm eating this fruit or vegetable and it's a sacred meal because it's dedicated. Krishnatarian, I talked about that. In Islam, people are supposed to do everything in the name of God, particularly eating. And pretty much every religion other than Christianity, eating is a sacred act. Whether the custom of actually eating the flesh survived in historical times, in any case of human sacrifice, is more than doubtful. Well, not probable. And that probably indicates to me, too, that, okay, maybe it wasn't that common. It's something heard of, so the people doing it, maybe, it was excused by generals in war. It was, something people did when they thought they could get away with it at times, but it wasn't like a normal thing. Just like the news nowadays. People think, oh, it happened on the news, so, He tries to show from this repulsion that in any offering simulating human sacrifice, the sacrificial meal was intended to fall out of use, and in the case of animal piacula, the sacrificial meal is generally wanting or confined to the priest. But his theory of piacula, his explanation for the reason of throwing the carcass outside the camp, is rather forced. He maintains that the substitution and human sacrifices closely paralleled burning of the flesh of the Hebrew sin offerings outside the camp, and that there is hardly any doubt that originally the true sacrifice, i.e. the shedding of blood, as in the Hebrew sin offering, took place at the temple, and the offering was a distinct act. There is, however, our theory of demoniac exorcism, no necessity to connect the sin offering with the substitution of the firstborn. The rites take their origin from two widely distinct sources. Probability is such a hypothesis rests on the evidence pro and con of the... Okay, I've read that. Tyler, in his article, Cannibalism, in the Encyclopedia Britannica, says, it has been well argued that had the men of the Quaternary period been cannibals, we should find the bones generally cracked for the marrow like those of beasts, which is not the case. Sometimes not. Also, that as regards the ancient people of the shell mounds, had they cleaned their own species, they would have thrown the human bones into the rubbish heaps with those of the beasts and fishes. Not necessarily. The discovery of a few ancient human remains at the site, which seems to indicate that the flesh had been eaten, may perhaps be taken to show that prehistoric savages were in this respect like those of modern times, neither free from cannibalism nor universally practicing. At the same time, the evidence brought forward at Congrès National pour les Études Préhistoriques in 1867 shows that the prehistoric man at one time of his existence